My name is Matt Feldman. I'm the immediate past president and CEO of the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago. And today, and I'm retired, although I'm in a very active retirement and serve on several nonprofit boards and one for-profit board.
That's exciting, Matt. Thanks so much for making time join us on the Heavy Podcast. Before tell us a little bit more about, a thumbnail version of your career to date. I realize it's been very diverse and very fruitful. Anything that you can highlight from their perspective, would love to hear that.
Sure. I actually refer to it as variegated because there's no consistent theme other than me and a continuing desire to learn at the same time I contribute. And if those two things don't exist, then I generally don't do it. And as long as they exist, I do it, even if it's not pleasant to do. And my career sort of looks like that. We'll ignore my formative years, other than to say I've worked in a bunch of what people would consider odd jobs, including serving as an exterminator for the City of New York Health Department and driving a taxi. And basically learned a lot about how to learn about people. And that has sort of carried me through my life. At some point we'll talk about books. Very early on, I was given a book that sort of changed my perspective on the world that I now offer to everybody. That caused me to start thinking about how groups of people behave and how to influence that behavior and how to address the behavior when it's dysfunctional. And a lot of that threads through my work career. And I had a couple of false starts after college. I worked in an actuarial consulting firm, which was great for them, but not necessarily great for me, although it did introduce me to defined benefit pension plans, which are today, but were very prevalent at the time, which is the mid 70s. The Employer Retirement Income Security Act had just been passed. And since no one was an expert, the firm billed me as an expert, which was sort of interesting since I really didn't know anything about it other than the fact that I was capable of reading the entire legislative history of ERISA. I went to work for the largest bank between both coasts in 1979. That was a bank called Continental Illinois National Bank and Trust Company of Chicago. And in 1984, it did everything but fail. So it collapsed and had to be rescued. But the day I joined it, it was named one of the 5 best managed corporations in America. And that's relevant to the story because when I got there, I discovered that there were a lot of brilliant people knitted together in a reasonably dysfunctional organization. And dysfunctional organizations can defeat well-intentioned, intelligent, hardworking people. And that's what happened at Continental. And found myself in the position a few years later of being tapped as so I was one of the 4 executives who were put on a team to figure out how to rebuild the bank. That was a defining moment in my career because it taught me to go into a part of an organization or a business, not just talk to the senior people, but talk to everybody and try to build a picture of what it actually looked like as opposed to the way it was being described, and then try to execute on what it could be as opposed to what people dreamed it might be or deluded themselves into thinking it was. And that became sort of my standard for the rest of my career. I had 12 jobs in 15 years at Continental, at least by my count. And then when we sold the bank to Bank of America in 1994, a colleague of mine and I founded what morphed into an e-learning company. At the time, it was an interactive multimedia CD-ROM based company. I didn't mention I'm sort of a techno geek, and I have been my whole life. I may not look at today in the normal Silicon Valley version, but I was pretty innovative in the days when innovation was a little lower tech than it is today, and have stayed connected with it over the years and still very involved in certain kinds of technology developments and information technology. So we had that company for 8 years. It was founded by angel investors and funded entirely by angel investors, about $20 million of angel investor money, which in those years was sort of large.
Wow, that's impressive from the angel investor perspective.
Yeah, go figure. It wasn't the time for an e-learning company to do non-technology, non-compliance-based e-learning. We built outstanding products that cost too much to build and sold too little. There was a point where I worried that we'd raised so much capital, we could more easily raise capital than we could sell product. And that's not a good model for a company. And eventually, we did end up having very good penetration in investment banks and commercial banks, particularly the largest ones, the global ones. And then 9/11 happened, and training budgets in those particular organizations collapsed, since most of our clients were training people south of Fulton Street in Manhattan. And we limped along for a couple of years and then decided we wouldn't raise any more money and folded the company, but not before we found jobs for all the employees. And went around to the 150 investors that had been my angel investors, including, of course, the Feldman family, and explained to all of them that we had lost all of their money, which was another defining moment in my life. I was recruited to the Federal Home Loan Bank of Chicago back in 2003. The pitch at that point was they've turned a home loan bank into a competitor for Fannie and Freddie Mac, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And I couldn't understand how that could be. Really didn't know much about home loan banks, knew a little bit about Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I can tell you now, the reason I didn't understand was because you can't do it. And the design and execution around trying to do that almost killed the bank. And over a period of about 4.5 years, various means of fixing it were tried, but never in alignment with the regulator. And in 2008, or late 2007 and early 2008, we attempted a merger with the Dallas Bank. This may sound familiar to you. And it failed. And when it failed, the regulator, in consultation with the board, decided that I should end up as the CEO. And not that I had applied for the job, just that I was appointed to the job. And given the job, having been in a startup that had failed and had watched any number of businesses collapse and rebuild, strangely enough, I was actually qualified to be in that job and see if we could right the bank, do the right thing by its members, because home loan banks are cooperatives, and build something that made sense as a cooperative, which over the ensuing time we did. We went from unambiguously the sickest of the home loan banks, and there were metrics around that would kill a normal company. For example, the market value of equity, which essentially is the market value of the bank, went from a low of minus $740 million to about 5 billion plus on the balance sheet, and another 2 billion that we'd repurchased from our members. So if this had been a stock company, it would have been quite an interesting achievement. But even for the membership, it was a wonderful thing to do, and for a systemically important institution. And along the way, we transformed the culture. In fact, the simple thing to say about that bank is we didn't change the name, but we changed everything else about it.
So one thing,
the culture, the operations, excuse me?
No, I was gonna jump in a little bit on that point.
Go ahead.
It seems like a little bit of a recurring theme as you were, transforming the different financial institutions and banks, not only from the digital perspective, but just the overall turnarounds. If you were to highlight certain parts that really help you succeed from that perspective, can you speak a little bit from that perspective? What are some of the things that you really focus on as you take on some of these initiatives to really to turn things around?
So I learned a long time ago, and my first turnaround was uh, an international investment business that was based in London, but I was based in Chicago, and we lost all of the staff, and the system failed, and we had to put it back together and support about $2 billion of assets under management. And I learned very quickly that you start by identifying what the problem is and then making it abundantly clear to everybody in the same language. You don't use fancy terms. You don't use confusing vernacular. You come out and you say, we have a problem. This is what the problem is. This is how we intend to fix it. And we promise you we will report back to you all along the way until you don't want to see us anymore or until it's fixed. And that has been the approach I have taken since the mid 80s in terms of building a consensus of what needs to be done. And in the case of our bank, that consensus began with the regulator, but it also included all the employees. I stood up in front of an all hands meeting of all the employees as I was the surprise appointment as the president of the bank. And I said, they've given us a very short period of time to demonstrate we can make change occur, but we all know what needs to be done. And many of them did. I mean, this was not a collective delusion, if you will. There were a lot of people in that bank who actually knew what to do to fix it. And all I needed to do was identify the right ones and put them in positions of authority and then support them. And, Sanjay Bhasin, who runs the Dallas Bank, Michael Erickson, who runs the Chicago Bank, are two excellent examples. But I recruited an executive team and said, one, you're all mostly younger than me, so this is an opportunity to fix a roughly $90 billion bank. And if we're successful, it'll make your careers. I don't have a career to worry about, so we don't have to worry about mine. But I want you to think of it that way. But in order to do that, we have to have a commonality of purpose, which means we are going to get together and understand what we are about. And we're going to do it with a frequency that is not normal in many corporations. And we created a morning meeting, which feels more like what would happen in a capital markets division of a firm, where we all got together and we talked about the fixes we needed to put in, and whether they were capital markets related, whether they were member related, whether they were operational related, whether they involved the regulator, whether they involved policy changes, whether they involved the board. And each of us would walk off with our instructions. And more often than not, I wasn't driving that meeting. I was walking off with a set of instructions that were uniquely my responsibility to deal with. What we do with the regulator, so they understand what we're doing. How we inform the board, so they understand what we're doing. What we're going to say to the public face, how we're going to talk about it to the membership. All of those things ended up in some way falling under my purview. And then sometimes it was a matter of getting the rest of the bank in line on what was going to be complicated solutions. It might involve systems changes. It often did involve systems changes, since our systems were, in many cases, archaic. In fact, I used to use the analogy that if you looked at many third world countries in the early 2000s, they had not bothered to lay down landlines. They had literally jumped to cellular. Because it was easier for them to do than it was for them to create landlines and traditional telephones. And that jump to cellular enabled them to do things that the United States really is only doing now. in terms of mobile currencies and mobile transactions, where, in places like China and India, those were happening 15 years ago. So there's using the fix of technology or process redesign, but then there's the lift that you get from that. And one of the biggest lifts is the organization and the people in it begin to believe that they have a role that has impact, that they can actually be a part of fixing something important, or when we were done fixing, of building something important. And guess what? That's a whole lot more fun than showing up to work every day and doing your job, parking your brain at the door and picking it up on the way home.
Yeah. So on that point, as you were recruiting and building the team to help you transform these companies, tell us a little bit more about that interview process. What are some of your go-to questions? How do you go about recruiting in general, and what do you look for in the responses when you interview the candidates?
So I'll get there, but I want to start with something that's very important. This bank was in crisis. We didn't recruit anyone new. I asked some of the people who were not part of the equation going forward, who had been either obstacles or unable to get their heads around the change, to leave quickly, and promoted what turned out to either be their very talented or incredibly talented subordinates. And so I built an executive team out of people who were already at the bank. And that actually went on for quite a while. I didn't recruit someone new to the bank for several years at the C-suite level. But what I got were a group of people who were A, players who mostly needed to learn how to work with each other. But once they learned how to do that and learned how to do their jobs, and of course, there's a learning curve when you take somebody from being in one position and drop them in another one, that allows them to leverage skills they had, but they have to acquire a whole new set of skills to be effective. And I'll give you a couple of examples if you'd like. That in and of itself is an energizing experience for the individuals if they understand that you're going to give them the opportunity to succeed, and you're going to help them if they're not succeeding to understand what they need to do to succeed. So you start with people who can succeed and make them prove to you that they can't succeed. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. I love the analogy. And I think it's interesting how that it's applied to that particular situation. So definitely.
Right. But it also applies in general, because what we started doing was moving people around. And my board used to refer to me as a recidivist reorganizer, because once every year or 18 months, I would move parts of the organization around so that my C-suite had new roles. So they weren't always doing exactly the same job. They might have kept parts of their job, but they also picked up different parts of the organization. And that had two very important consequences. One was they refreshed themselves and they learned new skills. And the other one was the rest of the organization couldn't stovepipe. They couldn't become comfortable working for a single individual and therefore not cooperating with others, because they never quite knew whether the next thing that would happen was they would be working for someone or working with someone who they weren't cooperating with before. And then, one final point is probably worth making. The C-suite found out that this was actually a good thing to do, and they started doing it with their direct reports, who started doing it with their direct reports. And for a small organization, and home loan banks are a small organization. Chicago happens to be the largest footprint in terms of people, but it's still a small organization. Refreshing the organization by giving people opportunities every few years is a great way to keep people longer, who otherwise might say, okay, well, I've done really well in this particular role. It's time for me to move on because I've maxed out there. So when we do interview, and by the time I was in this position, the kinds of people I would be interviewing were the rare direct reports I would hire. or they would be people who were direct reports of my direct reports, so people who were reporting into the C-suite. And by the time they got to me, if they weren't my direct reports, I had half a sales job to do, right? So my job was partly because people wanted me to see them, they obviously wanted to hire them, as opposed to wanted me to tell them no. I did that a couple of times, but it was rare. But what they really wanted to do was they wanted to give the person an opportunity to understand the global perspective that the bank operated on. And so what I would do is I'd use the interview, and I always insisted on an hour or more as an interview. I never allowed for 15 or 30-minute interviews. If they ended after 15 or 30 minutes, those were usually unsuccessful, because what I would say is, I want to learn something about you, but I want you to tell me what that is. And then I want to give you an opportunity to ask me questions, because you probably learned a lot about the organization at this point, but there may be holes in what you know. Or you're just curious about some things that are going on or that aren't going on that you're missing. And then I want your reactions. I want you to tell me what you think. And I always judge people by how well they did that, how well they organized the way in which they wanted to thread what they told me about them with the kinds of questions, the quality of questions they asked me, and honestly, at least the feeling of honesty and the kinds of comments or thoughts they had about other things that they felt we might do or might do less of. And those were by far the best interviews I had.
Yeah, that's an interesting perspective, and thank you for sharing for some of the strategies you deploy as you were interviewing and recruiting folks for all different levels and different size of organizations. That's always interesting.
Yeah, I should note, by the way, that by the time they reached me, they probably had been interviewed by 6 to 10 people, and if they were would be one of my direct reports, I required unanimous approval from the rest of my executive team.
Right.
Because I wasn't going to put somebody in the team who wasn't going to function appropriately in that team.
Yeah, absolutely. That makes perfect sense. And when it comes to innovation, as you turn around, transform the companies, taking that to the next level, and building and fostering a culture of innovation to continuously improve, continuously innovate is another endeavor on its own. What are some of the strategies that really helped you succeed in that space?
Well, first one is to allow people to open their minds and think and exercise critical judgment, particularly in organizations that are dysfunctional or broken or pick another word. Usually they're also abusive. And so in some ways, they have harmed the people who work there. And that may not be purposeful, but it certainly is an outcome. And one problem with most organizations that you're trying to fix is some people can't get out of the mode of being abused. They find it very difficult to go from being abused to being in control. And so unfortunately, even though you give them the opportunity, those people often don't make it. But the people who really make it are the people who knew they were being abused, did their jobs really well, and had a very strong opinion of how they could do them better if somebody just let them. And so opening that up and allowing people the opportunity not only to succeed, but to have fun and to thrive and to take risks that really aren't risks. They're really just expressing their views or trying something new is a huge part of innovation. Because I'm not the most creative guy in the world. I can innovate some things, but at the end of the day, if you have a 500-person organization and 400 of them want to innovate, then the opportunity to actually get something right is a lot higher. And the people who are CEOs are in positions where honestly they're not only not required to innovate, they shouldn't. They should support innovation. They should motivate innovation. They should reward innovation. They should reward failure, so long as people are trying to innovate. But by the time you get to be the CEO, you're not in a position that's close enough to the world of operations and customer service and product delivery to innovate. All you can do is applaud. So, you become the chief cheerleader of an organization that is successful. Now, in this last iteration, I had the ability to go from highly unsuccessful to incredibly successful. And I love that because it was the first time in my career that happened. I used to be invited to parties to clean up afterward. And it was rare that I was actually invited to stay. When I said I had 12 jobs in 15 years, I would get something in place and they'd literally pick me up and drop me someplace else. And, I'd say at the time, but I really like this. I'd like to stay around. And they usually would say something like, do you think we asked? And at this bank, I had the honor of not only participating in its repair, but then participating in its growth and its success. And, to me, I used to refer to this to my board. I would tell them it was a gift. They say, if they said, we really appreciate what you're doing, the answer would be, are you kidding? At the end of a working career, to have somebody tell you that you have the ability to put your management principles in place and then see them succeed wildly beyond your expectations is a gift. It's not a job. And I loved it because it helped me watch the employees succeed. So that's one. The second is understanding that the dynamics of population are themselves an innovative trend. So, the world is changing quickly, and, those people who call themselves white will not be in the majority of the population. And you can pick a date or ignore them,
Right.
because it doesn't really matter, because, people who are white aren't really white, and people who are black aren't really black. But one could argue that the way we have treated people who don't call themselves white has been different, and in some cases horrendous, relative to the way we treat people who are. And there are benefits that come from looking like me that do not come to everyone. And understanding that dynamic and opening up the culture so that it is an attractive place for the coming generations to work, by making it an attractive place for everyone to work today, was a big part of what we did at that bank. And I'm very proud of that. And it's not done because it can never really be done. But in a world where diversity, equity, and inclusion have become phrases, sometimes without meaning, we actually made a fair dent in going forward in that regard. Now, of course, when you make small steps forward in a world where people aren't making steps forward, you're considered an innovator, which is ridiculous because all you're trying to do is move forward. So we never got over our skis. We always at least accepted the fact that there was a long way to go and we were in the early part of the journey. And then finally, technology. Technology matters, and particularly matters in a bank. Banks really are people knit together by technology and reflected in finance. That's what a bank is. There's nothing else there. We don't make anything physical, and products are usually now digital in most forms. And it's the combination of the intellectual capacity of the people who work there and the quality of the systems that support them that make the bank successful or unsuccessful. And we had the benefit, not at the time, not thought of as the time as a benefit, of being low tech or horribly tech. The guy who ran my operating group for a number of years, who now runs the mortgage business at the bank, at one point showed a slide to our board of the systems architecture of the bank. And at least one board member thought it looked like a piece of modern art and had it blown up and hung on his wall. because it looked like, a Jackson Pollock painting, not an architecture designed for use. So understanding that allows you to do a number of things, and I'll just give you a couple of examples. And this goes back to the third world example. So think of this from, going from no landlines to cell phones. We early on decided that for operational reasons, we needed to, and it's not me, it was brought to me, digitize our desktops. So we wouldn't have any or very few personal computers linked into the network. They would all be instances on servers. At the same time, or roughly the same time, we decided to go to the cloud. And so we became one of the earliest, if not the earliest, full institution to go onto Amazon Web Services, which has led us to have a very nice relationship with them over the years, but also allowed us a huge amount of flexibility. So when the NATO summit took place in Chicago, which I want to say was about 2011 or 2012, it was going to happen down not far from our building. And for the protection of our employees, we declared that we would operate the bank virtually. And so we operated the bank virtually then, and we would do tests, and we had one major snowstorm where we operated it virtually. So in March of 2020, when all of a sudden everybody had to operate virtually, there were some things we had to adjust to because, we had it, for example, assumed that mail would be physical and readily available. There were a few other minor things that we needed to do in terms of making sure that our members had proper access to our systems. But there were no real systems in our building. They were all operated from someplace else. So our ability to operate virtually, and by the way, they are still largely operating virtually, was outstanding. And they continued to innovate virtually. So new systems have been installed virtually, and products have been innovated virtually. And meeting formats have been created virtually. In fact, some of the most moving meetings I've ever had in my professional career happened after the murder of George Floyd, when our African-American Employee Resource Group hosted a discussion that was one of the best attended meetings in the bank on how our colleagues felt about the murder of George Floyd. And when you see things on TV that talk about that, it is either impactful if you choose to have it impactful, or you ignore it because it really doesn't touch you. But when people you care about tell you about how painful it was for them to watch George Floyd murdered by the police, and one of them said, "I knew that could have been me," that really mattered. And in many ways, I think it had far more impact. And I know it had more impact on me, but I think it had far more impact than reading about it generically or watching it on TV and hearing about it from third parties. So tech becomes a very important part of what you do. And the fact that it had been neglected at the bank in some ways helped us. We ended up spending a lot of money to move ourselves forward, but the board was very supportive. Mm-hmm. And the last point I'll make, and I think it's an important one, is culture also includes the board. Mm-hmm. And I had the great fortune of, and I'm not on the board, I was not on the board of the Home Loan Bank, I was the most senior employee. But I had the great fortune of observing as a board was recruited of both member and independent directors who were just outstanding. And they built a board culture that was fed by a lot of information from us. So we made sure that not only did they have a great deal of knowledge of the bank, but they had enormous access to the employees in the bank and certainly the managers and senior leaders. So if a board member had a question about something, more likely as not, they didn't call me, they actually called the executive in charge. They might even interact with others. We had a day at the bank where the board would come in and visit with my C-suite and some of their employees, but not me, so that they didn't have to worry about what they said in front of me. Not that after a while anybody did. I think everybody was really comfortable that, you know, talking to the board was necessarily open and honest. And if we had disagreements, and we sometimes did, we actually had them in front of the board, because that just added depth of knowledge to the board. But the board also would arrange for lunches with small groups of employees, or breakfasts with small groups of employees. There was something called Meet a Leader that was actually created by our women's employee resource group and carried out throughout the bank, where each of us who were in the executive suite, and many people who were senior vice presidents, and many members of the board would sit down and have lunches or breakfasts with various employees and just talk about whatever they wanted to talk about. Getting to know the board as people is a fabulous developmental tool for employees. And by the way, and we were fortunate to have a diverse board, if employees can see people on the board who look like them, imagine how powerful that is. And imagine how powerful it is if summer interns see them. Because, you know, home loan banks don't have brand names like Goldman Sachs. But Goldman Sachs probably doesn't introduce the summer interns to their board members.
Yeah, absolutely. No, it's a topic that we could probably spend you know, a separate episode to dive into. So, which is very exciting to me, especially when you engage with the boards, the role of the boards, and, you know, just essentially how to construct a value add board members for your organization, regardless of the size. I think it's a very, very, you know, very pressing and interesting topic. That
it's not sophistry when I say I loved my board.
Right.
They were wonderful individuals. They were really tough as a board. This is not, they were easy, because they were anything but easy, because educated people who have the context straight are never easy. They're demanding, and demanding boards make you better.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole idea was to have a board that could properly govern the bank, could add credibility to the bank with the regulator, because that's very important also, and could take something away as individuals. And many of my board members have said over the years that they learned a lot about governance and leadership from the bank and took that back to their organizations, which is a wonderful thing to hear. And you know, and we would periodically lose independent directors to other member banks or institutions, and to the government. We lost a couple along the way to the federal government, including one to the Treasury Department. You know, to me, that's another part of the equation where, if an excellent board member has contributed meaningfully to the company and they want to move on, it's our job to help them do that too. Because again, you can't just assume that everyone's interests will always coincide with the interests of the company. But if they do things that are meaningful to the company, then the company owes them support.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Every episode I like to end with you know, a segment specific on your content diet. What do you consume on a daily basis to keep yourself informed? And moreover, is there a book that you always recommend to others, and why is that?
So I can't give you a book. I'll probably give you a few, but I'll start with my content diet.
Oh, good.
My morning read is the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Financial Times, and Fox News. And if you put the four of those together, you will find that they don't need and occasionally the Washington Post, and almost always Politico. And that's today. That's been this way for many, many years. And I don't always agree with what I read, but I need to see the spectrum of what's out there, because if I don't see the spectrum of what's out there, I can't understand what's going on. And it's very important to me that I not be trapped in an echo chamber of only those things I agree with. So that's my daily appetite. And there are, there are a bunch of books that come to mind relative to the topics. I'll go most current and then least current. The most current, and the one I've given now a few times and find very, very impactful, is Isabel Wilkerson's Caste, which, if you have not read it, is a brilliant articulation of the cultural structural racism in the United States. And she compares it to the Indian caste system and the way the Jews were treated in Nazi Germany, which is somewhat meaningful to me because I'm also Jewish. But that's not why. I think it's actually, there are many books out there about racism that that provide people who are not aware an opportunity to be resentful or angry or dismiss the arguments entirely. This one doesn't, because she suggests that we're all victims, right? We're all stuck within the caste as structured by the United States over 400 years. So I find that a very powerful book, and I think it's going to be uniquely helpful going forward to think about how we deal with structural racism in a non-judgmental way, because otherwise you can't get most individuals who look like me on board. Going back, some of the books that most impacted me in my career, that first one I started talking about is a book called Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And it was written in 1841 by Charles Mackay. And it's a book about crowd psychosis. And I actually did, both in high school and in college, studies on crowd psychosis, which impacted not only the way in which I manage and lead, but the way in which I invest. And to that end, another book that I always recommend is called The March of Folly. It's by the great historian Barbara Tuchman, came out in the 80s. And there, in her introduction, she refers to a monarch of Spain as the great wooden head of all monarchs, and then has the following quote, which is actually a quote from another historian. No failure of his principles could shake his belief in their essential excellence. And I think that is a brilliant guide for CEOs, that you cannot place yourself in a position where you're not willing to change your view of the world to what actually exists as opposed to what you prefer to exist, because otherwise no one will ever tell you that something is wrong. You will never hear it until after you fail. And then the last one, there was a great economist named Charles Kindleberger, who I believe was at Princeton, who wrote a book called Panics, Manias, and Crashes. And if you see a theme from the three books I've been talking about, it's because it's there. That's more financial related. But again, it's about markets, but it's really about crowd psychoses in markets. And they don't just have to be market driven. If you look at what happened as the pandemic hit and the kinds of reactions we saw at that point, if you look at what happened in 2007 to 2009, that wasn't just a market collapse, that was a systemic collapse. And understanding what a crash is, why it happens, and how recoveries occur are very important, not just to individuals looking at the world around them, but to leaders looking at the businesses they lead and government officials looking at the governments they're responsible for.
Yeah, I appreciate those recommendations. Definitely very thorough analysis, and we will make those titles and authors available in the show notes for our listeners. I'm definitely going to add them to my growing list of the books to read. So I definitely thank you for that. And overall, Matt, can't thank you enough for your conversation today. Very insightful. the strategies. You were very generous with a lot of the content that you had shared. So definitely thank you for that.
My pleasure. Great talking to you.